The brittle stillness inside the dimly lit storage annex shifted the moment investigators replayed the forgotten security footage, its grainy glow casting a narrow corridor where a lone figure moved with deliberate hesitation, pausing beside a snow-covered service door that had concealed the most consequential clue the case had ever held. Forensic dread settled quietly across the room. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. In the winter of 2004, Chicago carried its usual December weight, a mix of lake-effect winds and the restless anticipation of holiday traffic. The downtown lights had already begun their seasonal glow, creating pockets of warmth across a city that otherwise felt coated in steel-gray chill. For many longtime residents, including older men who had spent decades familiar with the unchanging rhythm of winters along the lakefront, the season was a reminder of predictable traditions. But for detectives assigned to the newly reported disappearance of 22-year-old college senior Megan Carver, December brought no tradition, only uncertainty, public pressure, and a complicated chain of events that began during the days leading up to Christmas Eve. Megan had last been seen leaving her part-time shift at a mid-sized bookstore near North State Street, a place decorated with evergreen garlands and window displays meant to encourage late-season shoppers. She was studying urban planning at a Chicago university, known by classmates for her quiet ambition and meticulous nature. Her parents, longtime residents of the western suburbs, reported her missing less than 24 hours after she failed to return home for a planned early Christmas gathering. The timeline was narrow, the weather unforgiving, and the city distracted by holiday congestion. But what brought immediate concern to detectives was her unwavering reliability, paired with the abrupt silence of her phone signal after she stepped out onto a sidewalk filmed by a streak of holiday lights and passing cabs. The missing person flyers, printed in urgent batches and taped to the doors of laundromats, restaurants, and commuter train stations, bore the portrait of a young woman whose life appeared intact and forward-moving. The case fit a troubling pattern seen in winter months: early darkness, reduced pedestrian traffic, and the ease with which a person could vanish between commercial districts and quieter residential blocks. By the time Christmas week approached, media began circulating segments questioning whether another holiday season would be overshadowed by an unresolved disappearance. The initial investigation established that Megan's walk from the bookstore to a nearby parking structure should have taken no more than 5 minutes. But the garage, built in the early 1970s and known for blind corners and outdated lighting, offered minimal surveillance coverage. Detectives found her car undisturbed on the second level, dusted lightly with the thin frost typical of December mornings. There were no broken windows, no signs of forced entry, and no indication she had retrieved anything from inside. The lack of physical disturbance created a void that investigators found deeply concerning. Whatever happened to Megan had occurred before she reached the safety of her vehicle. Reviewing available security footage became the backbone of the first phase of the investigation. However, most cameras along her path were analog models suffering from years of poor maintenance. Many tapes were overwritten regularly to conserve storage, leaving only small windows of available recordings. The clearest surviving clip showed Megan crossing a side street lined with wreaths hung from lampposts. She appeared calm, not rushing, not visibly reacting to anything around her. But a second figure, partially obscured by passing headlights, appeared several paces behind her. The footage quality made it impossible to determine whether this was coincidence or potential surveillance by an unknown individual. Chicago's holiday foot traffic made interviewing witnesses challenging. People were distracted, hurried, carrying shopping bags, late for gatherings, and seldom paying attention to strangers on the sidewalk. Detectives canvassed local businesses, focusing particularly on those with storefronts facing the route Megan regularly took. One clerk recalled seeing a young woman matching her description, but admitted that December nights blurred together. Another witness, a city maintenance worker, believed he saw someone standing near the parking garage entrance, though he couldn't recall details about posture, clothing, or direction of movement. No information gathered rose above the level of vague familiarity. The investigation shifted focus toward Megan's digital records. Phone logs indicated her device, last connected to a tower located between the bookstore and the garage, before dropping completely offline. Bank and card records showed no activity after her shift ended. Family members confirmed she had been looking forward to upcoming holiday gatherings, eliminating the likelihood of voluntary disappearance. Each verified detail made the case heavier, creating an emotional resonance especially among older residents who followed the story on nightly news broadcasts, recognizing the ache of families facing uncertainty during a season meant for reunion. Snowfall increased as the final days before Christmas neared, making outdoor searches increasingly difficult. Volunteers from local retirement groups, veterans associations, and community patrol teams helped widen the search grid, covering alleys, underpasses, stairwells, and transit-adjacent spaces. Detectives expanded the radius beyond the immediate downtown core, aware that offenders sometimes transported victims to secondary locations to avoid discovery. Yet each sweep returned with nothing. No clothing, no discarded belongings, no fingerprints on railings or door handles that connected directly to Megan's disappearance. By late December, frustration seeped into the case file. Detectives requested a deeper audit of all available footage, including storage rooms that held outdated equipment rarely checked. It was during this tedious process, days after Christmas, when the city was transitioning into the slow calm before New Year's Eve, that an officer discovered a mislabeled box containing backup tapes from a security company contracted in early 2004. Though the company had since updated to a different system, the tapes had remained in an annex facility away from routine archiving. Among those tapes was a recording from a camera mounted beside a service door near the parking structure. The camera angle faced an access corridor seldom used by the public, but known to garage employees, delivery drivers, and maintenance staff. The footage, time-stamped within minutes of Megan's last confirmed sighting, appeared warped by age and environmental wear, but still salvageable enough for review. The initial pass through the tape showed little more than passing light variations caused by traffic and the intermittent flicker of an old fluorescent fixture. But at the precise segment corresponding with the narrowing window in Megan's timeline, a figure stepped into view, tall, dark jacket, purposeful steps. The person paused near the service door, looked over a shoulder, and then disappeared out of the camera's frame. The timestamp placed this movement just after Megan should have walked past the adjoining street. What investigators did not see, but immediately suspected, was that the unseen stretch beyond the frame might hide the point of interaction. This was the footage replayed in the annex room weeks later, the clip that reintroduced momentum to the investigation. Detectives noted the directionality of the figure's movement, the proximity to the garage's internal access routes, and the likelihood that this person had routine familiarity with areas the public rarely used. It pushed the investigation toward individuals with privileged access, employees, contractors, or anyone involved in building operations. Records from the early 2000s were inconsistent, some handwritten, others stored in outdated databases, many incomplete due to staffing transitions. Yet the effort to assemble a list of potential persons with access to restricted areas continued steadily. The search eventually returned the name of a maintenance contractor, Daniel Mercer, who had worked sporadically in the garage throughout 2003 and 2004. Mercer had no criminal record of significance, only minor citations related to expired permits and low-level equipment violations. But investigators flagged him due to his documented familiarity with the exact service corridor captured in the recovered tape. Further review of employment logs revealed that Mercer's last confirmed shift occurred on the day Megan went missing. His departure from the job shortly afterward, citing schedule conflicts, struck detectives as potentially meaningful. The decision was made to re-review footage from other locations where Mercer had worked, though much of it was either overwritten or ill-preserved. Detectives began building a timeline of Mercer's movements throughout that week, cross-referencing vehicle registration data, archived building records, and any traceable interactions with staff members. While none of this qualified as direct evidence, a pattern began forming of someone who operated quietly, kept minimal contact with coworkers, and had access to secluded areas of the garage. The renewed investigation gained moderate press traction leading into New Year's week. Evening news anchors referenced the holiday disappearance, connecting it to broader discussions about urban safety during winter months. For many older viewers, including retirees who had lived through decades of Chicago's cases both solved and unsolved, the story carried a sense of familiar melancholy. Yet the investigation lacked the critical breakthrough needed to move beyond speculation. The weather shifted again as early January settled over the city. Snowbanks grew denser, roadside salt left pale streaks along sidewalks, and the Chicago River adopted its winter stillness. Detectives persisted, expanding the analytical review of the footage. A request was submitted for digital enhancement, using software capable of stabilizing analog distortions. The process was slow and imperfect, but it began to reveal subtle details, posture, gait, and a narrow glimpse of footwear that could be compared with records of employees working that December. As the enhancement team progressed, investigators continued exploring Mercer's personal history. Public records indicated multiple residential changes, a tendency to move frequently, and a pattern of seasonal employment. Nothing directly connected him to prior criminal behavior, but his timeline remained suspiciously aligned with Megan's disappearance. Detectives located a former coworker who vaguely remembered Mercer mentioning frustrations about holiday work hours, though the statement offered no clear investigative direction. Without physical evidence, the case hovered in uncertainty. Yet the enhanced footage, though incomplete, would soon provide the first definitive shift in the investigation. It revealed movement previously unseen, something small, easily overlooked, but profoundly important. And that was where the most significant lead of the case began to form. The enhancement lab delivered its findings during the quiet stretch of early January, when the city was still adjusting from holiday fatigue and investigators were settling back into routine caseloads. What emerged from the stabilized footage was subtle and almost anticlimactic at first glance. The faint reflection of an identification badge clipped to the figure's jacket. It was not readable, yet its rectangular shape and lanyard position were consistent with building-issued credentials. The discovery reaffirmed the working theory that the individual near the service door belonged to a roster of employees or contractors with authorized access. That slender confirmation pulled detectives deeper into the operational structure of the parking facility and the patterns of personnel movement during the week of Megan Carver's disappearance. The footage also revealed one additional detail: the slight drag in the figure's left foot as he turned. While not definitive proof, it was a physical characteristic that could be cross-checked against employment records, medical histories where legally permissible, or documented workplace injuries. The investigative team began compiling every maintenance or contractor employee with any recorded foot, leg, or ankle injury within the preceding 2 years. As expected, the resulting list was small, and among the names was Daniel Mercer. This was not enough to establish guilt, but it was enough to justify placing Mercer under discreet surveillance while detectives re-examined his background. Chicago's winter landscapes became the backdrop to methodical observation: unremarkable brick apartment buildings, sodium-lit parking lots, plowed roadside edges where piles of snow grew heavier after each lakefront storm. Surveillance teams followed Mercer without interference, documenting his routines with procedural caution. He visited a small hardware store, a winterized auto shop, and a local diner frequented by blue-collar workers seeking warm meals during frigid mornings. Nothing he did was incriminating, but investigators noticed his tendency to avoid conversation and isolate himself even in casual settings. While surveillance continued, the Cold Case Review Unit began reconstructing the architecture of the garage's internal spaces. They examined blueprints, emergency access points, freight elevator paths, and storage bays no longer in regular use. Older structures often contained alcoves that escaped routine inspection, and detectives suspected that if a crime occurred within the facility, it might have been facilitated by such isolated pockets. A walkthrough discovered several narrow service corridors that connected directly to the area seen in the recovered footage. These corridors, though officially marked as restricted, were not locked during the years of the incident due to cost-saving measures and outdated maintenance standards. It became clear that someone familiar with the building could have used them to intercept Megan without drawing public attention. As winter deepened, progress remained incremental, but the accumulation of details eventually produced a faint outline of what might have occurred. Detectives continued to seek evidence that could either reinforce or eliminate Mercer as a suspect. Background checks revealed no history of violence, no arrests, and no restraining orders. But a pattern emerged of short-term employment, terminated contracts, and landlord disputes. These were not inherently criminal, but they portrayed someone living transiently, moving quietly through temporary positions. The breakthrough arrived unexpectedly when investigators accessed old maintenance reports archived by the garage's former management company. Among the documents was a record from mid-December 2004, indicating a malfunctioning lock on a storage room near the same service door caught on camera. The work order had been assigned to Mercer. Though such coincidences often arose in old cases, detectives recognized the significance. It placed Mercer at the exact location of interest within days of the event. Combined with his presence in the area during the relevant time frame, the circumstantial mosaic grew tighter. Despite these developments, the absence of physical evidence linking him directly to Megan's disappearance left the investigation vulnerable to collapse. Cold cases were notorious for generating promising leads that eventually dissolved under scrutiny. The detectives persisted by re-examining areas of the garage and surrounding blocks that were previously cleared. Winter conditions allowed for certain outdoor searches that freezing temperatures had initially prevented. Snow had shifted and melted repeatedly since December, altering the landscape, but exposing small items trapped beneath accumulations. In early January, during a sweep of a secondary stairwell rarely used by patrons, a search team discovered an object lodged behind a metal grate. It was a thin keychain pendant containing a small decorative emblem shaped like a compass. Megan's parents later confirmed that she often attached such pendants to her bags, though they could not guarantee it belonged to her. The discovery was logged, photographed, and submitted for forensic analysis. No fingerprints remained on its surface. The faint traces of organic material were inconclusive. Still, the location of the object suggested it may have been dropped during a struggle or abrupt movement. This finding intensified scrutiny of the stairwell's connection to the service corridor. Blueprints confirmed they linked directly, allowing someone to move between them without entering the main public area of the garage. Such an internal route would enable an offender with building knowledge to evade detection. Investigators began theorizing how Megan may have been redirected toward this concealed pathway, possibly by someone who presented as a staff member or acted with enough confidence to appear legitimate. Attention returned to the enhanced footage. Analysts revisited frame-by-frame sequences, focusing not on the figure's identity but on his behavior. The stance, posture, and orientation of his shoulders suggested someone waiting, not merely passing through. Subtle adjustments in body angle indicated acute awareness of the corridor's surroundings. It appeared deliberate rather than incidental. Combined with Mercer's documented familiarity with the building, a narrative contour began forming, though still unsupported by decisive evidence. Meanwhile, the passage of time since the disappearance weighed heavily on the Carver family, who continued visiting police headquarters for updates even as snowstorms made travel difficult. Local news outlets maintained coverage, especially in early January when cold case solvability discussions resurfaced. Older Chicago residents calling into radio programs reflected on similar cases from decades earlier, expressing a collective hope that advancements in technology might prevent Megan's disappearance from fading into unresolved history. A turning point emerged when the Cold Case Review Unit cross-referenced regional employment data. They discovered that weeks after leaving his maintenance job, Mercer had relocated to a rural area in southern Wisconsin, taking seasonal employment at a manufacturing warehouse. Detectives contacted local authorities there to obtain employment records, which revealed that Mercer had reported an ankle injury in early 2005. The injury matched the gait anomaly observed in the footage recorded just weeks prior. Additionally, investigators learned that Mercer's employment had again ended abruptly, consistent with his transient pattern. While none of this established criminal involvement, the cumulative weight of behavioral, circumstantial, and locational evidence warranted formal questioning. Detectives prepared to interview him, yet recognized the delicate balance required. A flawed or premature approach could compromise the investigation. The strategy shifted toward building an evidentiary profile strong enough to justify search warrants on both his former residence and storage units. He rented intermittently throughout 2003 and 2004. Efforts to locate his rental history uncovered one storage unit in the western Chicago suburbs that remained active under his name, despite irregular payment records. The structure, built in the late 1980s, retained older climate control systems and had recently undergone partial renovations. The facility records indicated that Mercer had last accessed it around the time he departed from his maintenance job. With this information, investigators sought and obtained a warrant to examine the unit for any items that might connect him to Megan. The search occurred during one of the coldest mornings of January, when temperatures dipped low enough to freeze condensation onto metal surfaces. Detectives, equipped with thermal gloves and evidence containers, entered the unit. What they found did not immediately stand out. Boxes of old tools, work uniforms, documentation manuals, and unused electrical components. But deeper within the clutter sat a sealed plastic container labeled generically as personal items. When opened, it revealed a collection of objects that seemed disparate and unimportant. Receipts, outdated maps, small hardware pieces, and seasonal tokens like a New Year's Eve noisemaker from an unknown year. However, among these mundane remnants was one item that shifted the entire direction of the case. A bookstore employee schedule printed on an early 2000s inkjet sheet bearing the name of the store where Megan worked. The discovery was striking. There was no legitimate reason for Mercer to possess such a document. The schedule matched the week of Megan's disappearance, listing shift rotations that were never distributed publicly. Investigators immediately seized the document for forensic examination. Though the paper's age made fingerprint recovery unlikely, the presence of the schedule itself carried major implications. It suggested that Mercer had monitored or collected information about the store's operations, or potentially about Megan specifically. The team moved quickly, securing a second warrant to search Mercer's Wisconsin residence. There, in a small desk drawer, they found another set of papers that raised even greater concern: handwritten notes referencing the layout of the garage, including a rough sketch of the service corridor. The notes were undated, but aligned with the building's configuration at the time of the incident. While still circumstantial, they reinforced the likelihood that Mercer had studied the environment in which Megan disappeared. By the time investigators prepared to bring Mercer in for formal questioning, the case had evolved considerably. The Chicago Police Department collaborated with Wisconsin authorities to coordinate a controlled, uneventful detainment. Mercer did not resist. He appeared calm, perhaps even unsurprised, as officers escorted him from his residence. His demeanor was observed carefully, but he offered no statements. In the interrogation room, detectives presented him with the accumulated evidence: the building sketches, the employee schedule, and his presence in the security footage. They outlined the timeline with precision, emphasizing the realistic and procedural nature of the reconstruction. Though Mercer remained silent throughout the initial questioning, his lack of reaction to certain key details, particularly the footage timeline, was noted carefully. Investigators recognized that silence alone held no evidentiary value, but behavioral analysis contributed to the growing portrait of someone who had long expected this outcome. The investigation now depended on linking these findings to concrete proof that Mercer had been with Megan after she left her shift. The next breakthrough would unexpectedly arise from a technical direction that had not been fully explored earlier, involving old cellular network logs and environmental signal mapping from 2004. Data that, when reinterpreted with modern tools, revealed a previously unnoticed anomaly. And that anomaly would finally begin to close the gap between suspicion and confirmation. The anomaly emerged from a reanalysis of early 2000 cellular routing behavior, a field that had evolved substantially since Megan's disappearance. In 2004, cell tower triangulation lacked the precision available to later investigators, and environmental interference, particularly in dense cities like Chicago, often distorted location approximations. At the time, the final ping from Megan's phone had been dismissed as inconclusive because it pointed to a broad radius between commercial and residential blocks. But now, using modern reconstruction algorithms, analysts could reinterpret archived data with far greater clarity. The updated model produced a different picture. Megan's phone signal did not simply vanish near the parking structure. Instead, it briefly connected to a signal pocket generated by a repeater unit inside the garage's internal maintenance hallway. Repeater units of that era were rarely documented in public architectural plans. They were small, functional devices installed to strengthen signals in underground areas. Detectives confirmed that the garage had one such unit in 2004, placed in a location accessible primarily to maintenance workers. This alignment between the reinterpreted signal log and the building's historical infrastructure suggested that Megan had passed through, or had been brought through, the service corridor rather than the public entrance. The significance was more than circumstantial. It indicated a precise narrowing of her last known location. Investigators turned their focus once more to the stairwell where the keychain pendant had been found. Their earlier search had covered the most visible areas, but they now looked for micro-evidence, cloth fibers, transfer traces, or unusual dust patterns that could indicate interaction. Forensic teams examined the stairwell's metalwork and drywall seams with improved detection instruments capable of identifying remnants that 2004 technology could not. The process was slow and meticulous, the stairwell sealed off from public access to preserve integrity. After several days of scanning and analysis, they identified a set of degraded fibers snagged deep behind a rail post, consistent with clothing worn in cold weather. The fibers, though too damaged for traditional comparison, contained polymer signatures matching the general make of the winter coat Megan had been wearing. The inability to extract definitive DNA was disappointing, but not unexpected. Still, the fibers' presence in a restricted stairwell heightened the likelihood that she had been inside that area. Combining this with the updated phone signal interpretation, detectives strengthened their timeline reconstruction, concluding that Megan's final movements brought her closer to the core of the building's maintenance passages. While investigators refined their reconstruction, they continued studying Mercer's habits, especially his tendency to take jobs that offered access to secluded infrastructure. Employment records revealed that he had previously worked on maintenance teams for transit-adjacent buildings, storage facilities, and large parking structures. A pattern emerged of someone comfortable navigating spaces where public visibility was minimal, and where his technical knowledge gave him unobserved mobility. Even without a criminal history, his movements across jobs formed a behavioral backdrop that matched the conditions surrounding Megan's disappearance. Interviews with former coworkers, many now retired or living in other states, offered little in terms of first-hand observation. However, several described Mercer as meticulous about equipment rooms, sometimes reorganizing items or adjusting layouts even when not required. One recalled that he often arrived early and walked through service corridors before other staff members clocked in. These recollections did not prove wrongdoing but supported detectives' understanding of his familiarity with underused building spaces. The investigative pressure increased when forensic teams returned an unexpected finding from the documents seized in Mercer's storage unit. The ink composition on the bookstore schedule sheet matched a brand of printer ink widely available in 2004, rendering that detail unremarkable. But on the sheet's edge, near a faint fold line, analysts discovered degraded remnants of adhesive consistent with tape residue. Detectives considered whether the schedule had once been mounted on a surface, possibly to track staffing patterns. If Mercer had studied the schedule closely enough to display it, investigators reasoned he may have targeted specific departure times, particularly when holiday staffing caused predictable patterns. This development led detectives to re-examine the possibility that the crime involved planning rather than impulse. The building sketches found in Mercer's residence reinforced this emerging theory. Although crude, the sketches demonstrated awareness of blind spots, internal routes, and areas where lighting frequently malfunctioned during winter months. One sketch annotated a corner near the service door with a small mark, later interpreted as a note indicating poor camera coverage at certain hours. By mid-January, investigators compiled their findings into a cohesive briefing for legal authorities. They presented the enhanced footage, recovered documents, signal reinterpretation, stairwell analysis, and Mercer's historical patterns. While none of these elements independently established guilt, together they constructed a compelling narrative supported by technical evidence, behavioral analysis, and architectural correlation. Prosecutors agreed that the accumulated material established probable cause for expanded searches and additional forensic testing. The next major breakthrough came not from physical evidence but from an overlooked subset of building work orders. An analyst noticed that one maintenance report logged near the time of the disappearance involved a malfunctioning freight elevator on a lower level rarely accessed by the public. The report noted that the elevator had jammed briefly, then resumed operation without clear cause. The assigned maintenance staff included Mercer. Detectives visited the location, a dimly lit entry platform with concrete flooring and rust along metal framing. Forensic teams had not previously inspected the area due to its peripheral location and the absence of any known link to Megan's route. But with Mercer's documented involvement and the elevator's proximity to the stairwell, it warranted examination. The first inspection revealed nothing conclusive. However, after applying luminance scanning devices to detect material irregularities on the elevator platform, specialists identified faint streaking patterns partially preserved, where condensation had repeatedly frozen and thawed over the years. These patterns suggested that something had been dragged or shifted across the platform's surface in the time frame of the malfunction. The markings were too faint to identify their source, but they indicated a disturbance inconsistent with routine use. Taken with Mercer's presence in the building at that time, the anomaly added another layer supporting investigators' theory. Despite these accelerating developments, the case still lacked definitive evidence linking Mercer to physical harm or to possession of Megan's belongings. That impasse dissolved with the discovery of a small, overlooked storage box inside his Wisconsin residence. The box contained various functional items, light bulbs, screws, a worn flashlight, but beneath them lay a single, folded piece of fabric. Forensic analysis confirmed it was a piece of lining material used in winter gloves manufactured during the early 2000s. More importantly, embedded within the fibers were microscopic traces of cosmetic product. Megan's parents confirmed she typically used a distinct winter moisturizer, one that contained a compound rarely found in mainstream products at the time. Laboratory comparison showed that the compound present in the glove lining matched the moisturizer's unusual chemical composition. While this still did not conclusively prove that the glove belonged to Megan, it represented the most direct forensic connection found thus far. Combined with the established timeline, investigators now had enough evidence to construct a comprehensive theory supported by multiple data points. Prosecutors agreed to proceed with formal charges, pending the results of one final analytical review. This final review involved the recovered cell phone tower records and a corresponding database of maintenance access logs from the garage. Investigators cross-referenced timestamps of badge swipes, manual key entries, and elevator control overrides. Although the system had been partially digitalized only years after the event, archived fragments remained. Analysts discovered that a maintenance override had been activated on the freight elevator at a time, aligning with the disappearance window. The override was associated with an access key assigned to Mercer's job classification. While multiple employees held compatible keys, Mercer was the only one documented as working on site that evening. This discovery held substantial evidentiary value. It demonstrated that someone with Mercer's credentials interacted with the elevator during the critical time frame. Taken with the elevator platform's disturbance markings, the stairwell fibers, the schedule sheet, and the internal sketches, the picture grew sharply defined. Detectives and prosecutors worked together to formalize the case structure. The theory proposed that Megan, after leaving her shift, encountered Mercer near the service corridor. Whether by deception or sudden force, she was guided into the restricted hallway. The narrow design of the corridor would have rendered her virtually unseen from public areas. From there, she was likely taken down the stairwell, where her keychain pendant may have fallen, and eventually moved via the freight elevator to a further concealed location outside the building's public pathways. Although her remains had never been located, investigators concluded that the immediate environment around the garage was the probable site where the crime unfolded. With the evidence consolidated, prosecutors prepared charges of felony abduction, homicide under circumstantial proof, and obstruction of investigation. The lack of a recovered body did not preclude prosecution, as the totality of evidence met legal thresholds. A grand jury reviewed the case and returned an indictment against Mercer. During pretrial proceedings, defense attorneys argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that no direct physical proof connected Mercer to Megan. However, the prosecution countered by demonstrating the improbability of any alternate suspect possessing the same degree of building access, specialized knowledge, documented presence, and connected artifacts. Further forensic testing strengthened the prosecution's position. Trace environmental samples found on the glove lining from Mercer's storage box matched particulate residue unique to the garage's service corridor walls, a rare combination of paint compounds and winter salt particulates specific to that structure in 2004. The convergence of these elements formed a cohesive, scientifically grounded case. Faced with mounting evidence and the risk of a maximum sentence upon conviction, Mercer eventually agreed to a plea arrangement. He entered a plea for charges related to the unlawful restraint and death of Megan Carver, acknowledging responsibility without providing details of the event. The resolution, though procedural, brought long-awaited closure to a case that had weighed heavily on the Chicago community for nearly 2 decades. Megan's family received the confirmation they had lived years without, and investigators finally closed a file that had resisted clarity for far too long. Yet one final chapter remained to be written, detailing the case's aftermath, its impact on legal reforms, and the quiet ways Chicago institutional memory preserved the lessons learned. The courtroom proceedings that followed were marked not by spectacle, but by the deliberate, methodical pace characteristic of cases reconstructed almost entirely from investigative persistence rather than witness testimony. Older Chicago residents who had followed the case for years described the trial phase as a somber reflection on the discipline of forensic work rather than a dramatic confrontation. Mercer remained reserved, his demeanor unchanged from the day of his arrest. He offered no elaboration beyond the terms of his plea, leaving investigators and the Carver family with a resolution grounded in legal acknowledgement rather than narrative clarity. Yet this was often the reality of cold cases. Closure hinged not on understanding every detail, but on establishing accountability through evidence that held up under scrutiny. The judge reviewed the investigative record thoroughly before accepting the plea. The convergence of data points, the cell repeater mapping, the elevator override logs, the employee schedule found in Mercer's storage unit, the architectural sketches, and the composite pattern of fiber and environmental traces presented a structure of proof that met the legal threshold. Mercer received a lengthy custodial sentence consistent with offenses involving abduction and homicide under circumstances lacking body recovery, but containing sufficient corroborative evidence. His sentencing ended the formal component of the case, But the investigative work continued in quieter ways as procedural reviews set in motion, updates to archival protocols and data retention standards. For the investigative teams involved, the conclusion of the case brought not triumph, but a sense of restored equilibrium. They had carried the file through winters, digital transitions, staff retirements, and shifting public priorities. Many officers on the original roster had aged into retirement, and the younger generation who contributed to the case's resolution had grown into seasoned investigators while working through its complexities. The Carver case became emblematic of the value of preserving even minor evidence fragments, as each small piece, ignored in 2004, reconsidered in 2024, served a purpose when contextualized decades later. With the legal outcome finalized, attention shifted to how the city, its institutions, and its residents integrated the case into their collective memory. Chicago, a city defined by its layered history, had witnessed numerous investigations across its winter-laden decades. Yet this case stood out not because of sensationalism, but because of its reflection of urban conditions, the anonymity of public spaces, the hidden networks of service corridors, and the intersection between everyday movements and unseen vulnerabilities. For older residents, the resolution affirmed that persistence and technological advancement could revive cases thought dormant, providing a sense of grounded reassurance during holiday seasons often marked by reflection on time's passage. The Carver family chose to honor Megan's memory by establishing a scholarship fund supporting students studying urban planning, a field she had approached with quiet dedication. The scholarship emphasized practical design strategies for safe, accessible public spaces, connecting her academic interests to the lessons drawn from her disappearance. Winter ceremonies held in her name were understated, attended by friends, family, and community members who felt the impact of the case not through dramatic headlines, but through the steady, enduring presence of a loss experienced across 2 decades. The police department initiated a comprehensive review of evidence archiving practices directly influenced by the investigative hurdles encountered. The mislabeled storage box that had contained the crucial security footage became a symbol used in training programs for new recruits. Lectures emphasized the importance of systematic organization, redundancy checks, and the long-term preservation of analog footage during transitional periods. The department also updated guidelines for documenting maintenance infrastructure, ensuring that future building schematics included detailed notations of repeater units, access points, and engineering features that might influence digital forensics. As these institutional adjustments took shape, the broader landscape of cold case methodology also evolved. The Carver investigation was studied by regional law enforcement agencies for its demonstration of how reinterpreting old digital signals could reveal new movement patterns. The collaboration between analysts, forensic scientists, and architectural researchers underscored the interdisciplinary nature of modern cold casework. For investigative teams working on other long-dormant files, the case served as a reminder that progress could emerge from revisiting overlooked angles rather than expecting dramatic discoveries. Winter in Chicago continued its familiar rituals. Heavy skis over Lake Michigan, the grinding rhythm of snowplows, the muted hum of L trains moving through early darkness. Yet the case subtly reshaped public perception of certain city spaces. The parking garage where Megan was last seen underwent structural renovations that included improved lighting, updated camera systems, and restricted access to maintenance corridors. These modifications, though implemented quietly, reflected a growing awareness of how urban infrastructure could influence safety. Occasional winter visitors to the newly renovated facility would notice the brighter stairwells and clearer signage without necessarily understanding the history that had prompted the changes. Among investigators, one of the most lasting impacts was the reinforcement of a long-held, but often unspoken truth, that the resolution of cold cases is not powered by single revelations, but by incremental perseverance. Each interview, each archived sheet of paper, each overlooked detail possesses the potential to shift the trajectory of a case. Older detectives who had worked through earlier stages of the investigation described the resolution as a validation of the unglamorous parts of police work. The hours spent reviewing grainy footage, the page-by-page examination of storage logs, the patience required when confronting decades-old uncertainties. The Carver case also influenced public expectation surrounding cold cases. While some residents expressed relief at the long-awaited resolution, others reflected on the sobering realities that many cases lacked the layered documentation necessary for similar outcomes. The story became a quiet advocate for improved record-keeping, encouraging city officials to invest in consistent data preservation, even when budgets were strained by winter demands and infrastructure needs. Newspapers covering the conclusion emphasized the lessons learned rather than the sensational aspects, aligning with the pragmatic tone of the city's older readers who valued procedural clarity over dramatization. In the months following the resolution, community organizations invited investigators to discuss the case at winter safety forums and retirement groups. These gatherings often took place in modest meeting rooms warmed by space heaters, with attendees wearing thick coats and carrying thermoses against the cold. Many older city residents listened not for the narrative details. They already knew those from years of following the case, but for insight into how persistence had shaped the outcome. The presentations offered a distilled message that even when time seems to erase the edges of an event, records and recollections can still converge to reveal truth. The Carver family, desiring privacy, made limited public statements after the sentencing. They expressed gratitude for the decades of work invested by investigators and a quiet hope that Megan's legacy would endure through the scholarship fund. During holiday seasons, they continued to hold small gatherings where her memory was acknowledged through simple acts, lighting candles on Christmas Eve, placing winter flowers on their dining table, or walking through neighborhoods decorated with lights reminiscent of the ones she had passed on the night of her disappearance. These gestures stitched remembrance into the rhythm of each winter without the need for words. Chicago's institutional history absorbed the case as another example of the long arc of investigative effort, meeting the steady evolution of forensic science. The city's archives updated their entries to reflect the final outcome, noting the significance of the recovered footage, the reinterpretation of cell data, and the architectural insights that shaped the final months of the investigation. Law enforcement cadets studying the case in future years would encounter it not as a dramatic tale, but as a model for approaching complex, evidence-limited investigations with patience, structure, and respect for procedural rigor. As winter gave way to the first hints of spring, the final administrative tasks associated with the case were completed. Officers filed concluding reports, forensic teams stored their analyses in digital vaults, and prosecutors archived their closing documentation. The parking garage, now years removed from its role in the case, settled into routine urban function. People entered and exited without considering its past, its surfaces carrying only the most mundane traces of daily life. Yet for those who had worked the case, the memory of its corridors, once illuminated only by flickering lights, remained etched into their professional experience. By the end of the year, When Chicago again approached the holiday season, the case's closure served as a reminder that winter, for all its darkness and harsh conditions, could also mark the culmination of long, difficult journeys. The Carver investigation had begun during a season of lights and gatherings, where the absence of one young woman cast a shadow over a city accustomed to seasonal rhythms. It ended in another winter, not with celebration, but with a quiet affirmation of truth reclaimed through persistence. Older residents, reflecting on the case during end-of-year newscasts, described it as an example of how time, though capable of eroding evidence, could also create the conditions necessary for resolution. Advances in technology, the dedication of investigators, and the evolving understanding of urban environments had converged to restore clarity to a story once considered unreachable. The city moved forward, shaped subtly by the lessons embedded in the case. The necessity of preserving archival records, the value of cross-disciplinary collaboration, and the enduring endeavor of seeking closure for unresolved losses. In the quiet days following New Year's celebrations, when the city settled into the reflective calm that often accompanies early January, investigators who had worked the case found themselves returning mentally to small, defining moments. The recovery of the mislabeled footage, the discovery of the employee schedule, the faint signals from outdated cellular towers. Each step felt almost inconsequential at the time. Yet these pieces had collectively resurrected a path through decades of uncertainty. The final resolution was not marked by dramatic revelation, but by the slow, deliberate reconstruction of events through fragments left behind. The cold case was closed, its story fully integrated into Chicago's winter history, a reminder that even in a city defined by snow, steel, and time-worn streets, persistence could illuminate what had long been obscured. Megan Carver's disappearance, once an unanswered question overshadowing holiday seasons and winter gatherings, now rested within the structured, evidentiary framework of a solved case. And although the city continued forward, shaped by countless other stories, this one left a quiet mark, carried especially by those who had watched its unfolding across the years. For the Carver family, for investigators, and for the community that followed the case, the final chapter represented not triumph but completion, a steady, grounded affirmation that truth, though often delayed, remained attainable through diligence and time.